Here I am, ISHI 32, sitting down with Kevin Lord, who is the
lab liaison and bioinformatician at DNA Doe Project.
You could be the first bioinformatician that I've ever interviewed, ever.
Awesome.
What does that mean?
So, DNA Doe Project specifically, so nonprofit that deals specifically with identifying unidentified human remains.
Okay.
Those are the only types of cases we take. And we utilize whole genome sequencing pretty much for all of our cases.
Yeah.
And it's investigative genetic genealogy.
Okay.
So once that whole genome sequencing data comes back, there's a lot of work that has to be done because it's raw data, tens of gigabytes of data that you get back usually, and you can't just directly upload that to these genealogy databases.
Okay.
And so I do a lot of the work. I manage the pipeline of, we work with partner labs that handle all the actual lab work for the cases.
Okay.
And so I manage that pipeline through our partner labs from initial dealing with the agency all the way to a file we can then upload to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. And so once we get the data back from the sequencing lab, I work my magic and do a lot of stuff on the computer to eventually get it to a file that from tens of gigabytes down to maybe 10 to 15 megabytes or something like that we upload to the database.
Okay, so those are those specific sequences? Is that kind of what you're looking for there out of the entire?
Yeah.
When you're making it smaller, is that what you're doing? Picking out, popular areas?
Yeah, so the raw sequencing data, it's actually just a whole bunch of individual reads of fragments across the genome. And we get data back across the whole entire genome, over 3 billion base pairs. We don't care about all 3 billion of those.
Oh my gosh.
So the genealogy databases in total only maybe look at about maybe 1.5 million. So it's taking all that raw sequencing data and getting it down to the informative SNPs that we actually care about.
So that's the bioinformatics part that you're doing.
Yeah.
Is there a program that is built specifically to do this, or is this you going through sequences, typing in sequences, cutting things out? How does that even happen?
Yeah, it's all using different pieces of software.
Okay.
A lot of it is software that's been out there published in journals, open source software. And I've kind of put together my own pipeline of different things that I've found have worked. We've now, DNA Doe Project has identified about 64 people, I believe, is our current number.
No kidding.
And we have maybe another probably 40 to 50 at least that we're working on still.
Okay.
And so I've had a lot of kind of experience through all those cases to figure out what works and what'll get us the best data and apply that.
So that's 64 cases that have been solved over what period of time, do you think?
So DNA Doe Project was founded in 2017.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The first announced solved was actually a couple weeks before the Golden State Killer case. So it was in April of 2018.
Okay.
And so that was the first announced solved. And so then all the rest have been since April 2018.
That is a high rate of return. I feel like that's very effective.
Yeah.
Actually.
I mean, we're up to about 140 cases that we have had in our pipeline, and like some of those have kind of stalled out trying to get better samples and things like that. So if we have around 140 and we've solved 64, taking away the ones that are kind of we haven't been able to get good data for, I mean, probably close around a 50% or higher success rate. And there's still a lot that all the teams are working on that will hopefully be solved also.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, the ones that aren't working out as well, is that then how do you have to go back to like an investigator or to, how are you getting more sample or things like that? Is that something that you guys would recommend? Like you're in contact with them and you're like, hey, this isn't quite working out. Do you have anything else that we could test? Or
Yeah, I'm kind of the main point of contact that deals with the agencies to figure out what evidence they have remains, what remains that it's not always remains. Sometimes in newer cases especially, they'll have blood cards that were taken at the time of autopsy and things like that, if it was a relatively fresh, I guess, remains. And so sometimes those cases, like we're happy to get those because it's
Yeah.
easy, but most of our cases we're dealing with DNA extracted from bones and teeth, and so
Right.
most of the time, I mean, obviously they often don't recover an entire skeleton, but
Right.
they have multiple pieces, and so we have kind of a pecking order of the things that we go for first,
Yeah.
and sometimes those don't work out, sometimes they do, and we'll try other ones. So oftentimes we'll have DNA extracted from one particular skeletal
Yeah.
element, and we'll bring it through that pipeline. Generally, a lot of times things will kind of fail in that sequencing
Yeah.
uh, sub step, and so in those cases, we'll either, in like in the case I'm presenting my poster on, we did whole genome enrichment, and that kind of helped
Okay.
get us over that hump. In other cases, we do have to go back to the beginning and say, okay, we tried these teeth, like, do you have any other bones? Can we try some of that? And then kind of have to start the process over from the beginning with
Yeah.
those. And we've had cases where we've had to go back 2 or 3 times and try to bring it through that process, and
Yeah.
eventually got good data.
So are you getting the DNA, like getting that bone, and then you're doing the extraction, or are there labs that are doing that for you
So
and
yeah,
sending you sequences? Like what part, where do you guys start at the
so
um,
we
DNA Doe?
and myself in particular kind of organizes everything
Okay.
and like kind of handles the logistics. A lot of the agencies, we work directly with the agencies. Sometimes we're
Okay.
working with the crime labs, but even the crime labs, it's a little bit outside of their
Yeah.
normal area of expertise, and so um, we have partner labs that we work with. There's a few different labs that we use for DNA extraction, and then there's some that we use for whole genome sequencing.
Okay.
And then I kind of handle the bioinformatics and once the sequencing is done. And so that's generally where we come in, is once the um, once the sequencing data is returned, then take it over. I'll process it, upload it to GEDmatch, and then
Okay.
we have around 50 to 60 volunteer genetic genealogists.
For real. Oh
Yeah, and
wow.
so
That's so cool.
once it's uploaded to GEDmatch, then a team leader will be assigned, and however many volunteers on that team, they'll all kind of, a team will be formed, and that will be handed over to them, and then they kind of take over the research part
What
of it.
an interesting way to get people to help. I mean, you know, using their time and, talents to help find these people. That's amazing.
Yeah, and a lot of, I
It's such a
mean,
cool idea.
there's a number of organizations out there doing the genetic genealogy, obviously,
Yeah.
but with the unidentified remains cases, really all cases, a lot of it does come down to how good the DNA matches are that
Yeah.
come back. And being a nonprofit, we can kind of spend the time on cases that would never be financially feasible for non-volunteer work. And so we've had cases where teams have literally spent hundreds or possibly even thousands of hours on one single case.
Oh my
And
gosh.
obviously, if you're charging an hourly rate or
Yeah.
something like that, like that's, the agency would never be able to afford it. So there's some
Yeah.
cases that we're able to take on and solve that might not be solved in any other way.
Yeah. So, in these cases that have been solved, the 64, are you aware of what has, transpired, or do you have any sort of contact with the people on the other end? Like, you're identifying a loved one, and then are you in contact with the loved ones of the deceased, or is it not to that level?
Sometimes. So we definitely get the law enforcement agencies that come to us. They
Okay.
pretty much are an open book to us for the most part, and like
Okay.
they'll give us all of the details they have on the case, any circumstances around how the remains were
Okay.
found, tips that they've come in that either they think might be good or might not be good. But I mean, they'll share a lot of that information, because when you go
That's
and do the
good.
genealogy, you don't really know what might be relevant and what
Right.
might. There might be
Right.
some little tidbit that the detective, that he didn't have the context, and it didn't
Right.
really make sense at the time.
Yeah.
But when we're going and looking at it, we've had initials on rings and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
That's helped. And so they share all that. And then once we do make that identification, sometimes we're in contact with the family, sometimes not. I mean, we hand that over to the law enforcement agency, and sometimes the family does want to talk to us,
Yeah.
or sometimes we help in that arranging the confirmation testing and things like that. And so there's some
Okay.
instances we do,
Yeah,
not all
because then that
instances.
family would then want to give you a sample to make sure that,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
it's
generally
confirmed.
that will
Okay.
be done by the law enforcement
Okay.
agency, but sometimes to help expedite the process, we'll send them even direct to
Yeah.
consumer Ancestry 23andMe type tests so
Yeah.
we can kind of do an unofficial
Sure.
confirmation.
Yeah. So how does that make you feel to know that you are, making a difference in people's lives?
Oh, it's extremely rewarding work. Um, it's just, I mean, a lot of the families, they when we identify them, they're not exactly getting full closure, but at least they have some answers to what happened to their loved one.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, when we do the identification, that's really the first step. Not all of these are homicide victims, but many of them are.
Yeah.
And the law enforcement agency, in many cases, when they don't know who the victim is, it's very difficult for them to even make any progress on
Right.
finding who committed the crime. And so we're kind of able to provide that first set of answers. This is what happened to your loved one. And then the law enforcement agency can hopefully take that information and in some cases run with it and kind of hopefully get justice for that person also.
Well, thank you for all that hard work that you're doing. I'm sure you've made a lot of people's lives, really fulfilled, or at least helped them in so many ways. That's really great.
I appreciate that.
Thanks for doing that.